Welcome to the show. This is The Magician and the Fool podcast, episode number 51. My name is Dominic. I am one of the co-hosts of the show. The other co-host is Janice, and you'll hear from him in a few minutes. Today we have the pleasure of speaking to Dr. John Opsopaus, who has practiced magic, divination, and neo-paganism since the 1960s. He has more than 30 publications in various magical and neo-pagan magazines, and has designed the Pythagorean Tarot and wrote the comprehensive guide to that tarot. He is the author of The Oracles of Apollo, which was released in 2017, and is the author of the new book, The Secret Texts of Hellenic Polytheism. Dr. Opsopaus frequently presents workshops on Hellenic magic and neo-paganism, Pythagorean theurgy, divination, and related topics. You can find more about him and his work at opsopaus.com. That's opsopaus.com. And from there you can also find his old website, Bibliotheca Arcana, and there are just dozens and dozens of really interesting and relevant articles to what we talk about on this show and what we will be talking about in this episode. Speaking of this episode, the main focus of the book and the episode is the Neoplatonic thinker Plethon. And like we mentioned in the episode, he is sort of a bridge between the old school Neoplatonists and the Renaissance Neoplatonists. So a very interesting topic. As always, thank you so much to our Patreon supporters. We appreciate you and are honored to have you partnering with us on this project. If you would like to also help support what we're doing, support this work, head over to Patreon, look us up, and pledge whatever makes sense. We dedicate this to Hermes and Asclepius, and may any merits that we accumulate doing this work be distributed to all sentient beings, so that they together with us may equally realize awakening. Okay, we are really excited to have John Opsopaus on the show today to discuss his new book and all things Hellenic Polytheism. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. I'm really excited to be on the show.
Glad to have you here. So let's start where we always start at the beginning. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got into this sort of world of Hellenic polytheism, and specifically how you got interested in this subject matter of Plethon?
Yeah, so I, like many kids, I was interested in the Greek myths. In fact, I'm pretty sure the first book I ever bought with my own money was a little thin book of Greek myths, from the bookmobile that came around to school. And so I was always very interested in mythology and Greek culture in general. I started teaching myself Homeric Greek when I was in college. So I had, kind of an interest in Hellenic culture. I remember thinking to myself, boy, in many ways, I feel more comfortable with these people, the ancient Greeks, than I do with many of my contemporaries, and I always kind of felt at home in Greek Hellenic culture, and so sometime later, and in the early to mid '80s, I really sort of embraced the fact that I was a pagan. And so I naturally gravitated towards Hellenic paganism. And that's really, when I started working on this stuff more seriously. And at that time, and really still, I think Hellenic pagans are a relative minority amongst pagans in general. And so I started, trying to find some resources, get some ideas about how to practice as a modern day Hellenic pagan, and meet up with other people that were drawn to the Greek and also to the Roman gods. And I started a networking service through postal mail originally, and eventually moving on to the internet to try and, coordinate events, share ideas about rituals. Of course, the advantage of Hellenic paganism over many of the other traditions is that it's so well documented. The ancient Greeks were a literate people, and because of their importance in Western culture, they've been studied to death. And so there's just a lot of material available, and we don't have to guess so much and make up so much as we might, with Celtic paganism or Norse paganism or other traditions. But so I started doing research to try and learn more about ancient religious and also magical practices, to then adapt them to the modern world, because I believe that all religions are organic, they grow, and have to adapt with the times. And certainly ancient Greek paganism was very diverse and ever evolving. So that's sort of a general background as to how I got into Hellenic polytheism. And in 1986, a book came out that was very interesting and very exciting, and that was Woodhouse's book, George Gemistos Plethon, The Last of the Hellenes. And this was about George Gemistos, who called himself Plethon, who was a neo-pagan living in the late 14th and early 15th century in Constantinople, and then later in Mistras in Greece. So he, what this person did, a philosopher, Platonic philosopher, was essentially produce I would say, the first neo-pagan religion, in the sense that he was taking the ancient practices and the ancient philosophy and essentially designing a religious system suited to his times. So late Middle Ages, early Renaissance. And so in that sense, it's a neo-pagan religion. It's a reconstruction. And it's not a continuous tradition that's been handed down from ancient times, although it's built on the ancient traditions. The problem was that while Woodhouse's book was very good in many respects in terms of talking about the life and times of Plethon and giving some translations, he didn't translate a lot of the major work that is important for practicing pagans. So I should maybe back up a little and say that when Plethon, as I'll call him, was alive, he had written this book of laws that basically lays down how to practice his polytheistic religion. And this was a secret, although people suspected him of being a practicing pagan, but he kept it secret because you could be executed and tortured for practicing paganism. So he kept it secret during his lifetime, and apparently had some students. We know he had some students, and some of them apparently also practiced this religion. But the book wasn't discovered until after he died. and much of it was burned. About 3/5 of it were burned, but the rest survives, and the rest of the surviving parts are translated in my book. But this was the problem with Woodhouse's book that came out in '86, was that he summarized some of the stuff. He really didn't present enough of the actual ritual material to practice. And so while it was very enticing, it really was not useful. And so I thought, well, that's kind of sad. So I went and I got the Greek text that was published in, I think it was 1858. I've forgotten the date now. But in the 19th century, with a French translation. And, I got that book and spent some time with it. But it was, my French is not particularly good, and my Greek at that time was not sufficiently good either. And I said, well, it's just too bad, but I'll just have to wait for somebody to translate this into English. Well, unfortunately, nobody ever did. And since then, in the past decade, people have got interested in Plethon again, and there have been several good books written about his philosophy, again, without a complete translation of his Book of Laws, though. And so I finally decided, well, I really need to do this. And so I read these books, of course, which helped to explain his whole philosophical and religious system. And I also translated, mostly over the past 2 years, the Greek text into English, just so I would have a working translation, so I could tell exactly what his rituals were. So then I wrote the book, and the book explains then for a modern practitioner his philosophy, and also sets out his calendar. He has a whole ritual calendar for the whole year, and it sets out his various rituals and invocations, and he has a set of 27 hymns, and so it translates all of the hymns that are also used as part of the rituals. And so I wrote that all out, and ultimately we also decided to include my working translation of his Book of Laws as an appendix, a rather lengthy appendix. I think it's about 100 pages in my published book, with some translations of some of his other material as well. So it was mostly to be able to get, a clear enough translation of the surviving parts of his work to be able to practice it myself, and then also to present that for other people too, as well, that are interested in his philosophy and his religion, and might be interested in practicing it or adapting, some of his practices to their own religious practice.
That's great. Yeah. No, thank you for doing this work. I mean, having primary sources are kind of invaluable, I think, rather than just getting an author's, synopsis or whatnot. Having it actually translated is really valuable. So the Book of Laws, I believe we have 16 chapters that survived. How many chapters were there in total? Do we know?
Oh, yes, we do know, because one of the things that survives is a complete table of contents.
Oh, wow.
And off the top of my head, I don't remember the number of chapters, but I think it's over 100, actually. And so that sounds pretty bad, 16 chapters out of, let's just say 100. But fortunately, some of the ones that survive are quite lengthy.
Okay.
I mean, the chapters vary widely in length. Some of them, one of them is just one paragraph long, but others go on for page after page after page. So, for example, all of the 27 hymns, that's one chapter.
Great.
And all of the invocations is another chapter. So, of course, it's hard to estimate what's not there. But let me tell you a little bit about what happened. So, the person who ended up ultimately getting a hold of this book after he died was Georgios Scholarios, who was a major Greek Orthodox religious figure of the time, and eventually became patriarch of the Greek Orthodox Church. And so, and he had suspected Plethon of being a pagan for a long time. And so this was his proof. So on the one hand, he wanted to destroy the book, but because Plethon was a famous philosopher, he knew there would be a lot of criticism for destroying sort of the magnum opus of this well-known philosopher. So what he said he did is he preserved enough of the book to prove his crime, basically. And he tells us that he spent 4 hours ripping out pages out of the book and burning them. So, that's a lot of burning, I guess you would say, but what he preserved, of course, was the stuff that, showed that Plethon was had a practical pagan religion. And so that's in many respects the most important stuff for us as practicing pagans. What he burned were unfortunately, some quite important philosophical chapters about prayer, about the gods, about daimons, and it would be very nice if we had those. But we can kind of guess what Plethon probably said, because he said, "I'm not inventing anything new. I'm just basically building on the work of my predecessors." And in fact, he gives a sort of a golden chain of 28 predecessors that are the basis for his work. And the last 8 of them, in fact, are all well-known Platonic philosophers from which we have works. And so he was working from Plato, of course, and Plutarch, and Iamblichus, and Porphyry, and Proclus probably, and some other sources as well. So in a sense, we kind of know what he was reading and what he was using as the basis of it. So we can reconstruct, pretty reasonably what some of those destroyed chapters said. And in fact, I have a chapter in my book that tries to reconstruct some of these lost parts. Not word for word, of course, but in terms of the ideas. And so, Hladký, who is one of the authors who has written about Plethon, based on, the number of chapters and kind of guesses about what they might have contained and the amount of time that Scholarios spent burning stuff, the estimate is that he probably burned about 3/5 of the book. So we probably got about 2/5, but they're, a very important 2/5, in terms of understanding the actual practice, the ritual practice that Plethon was teaching.
Okay. Yeah, you answered a few of my questions. I was going to ask what were some of his sources. And then I was also wondering, I was thinking, if someone's burning this book, they did a really bad job. Like, how can you throw a book into a fire and then have 16 chapters survive? But that makes more sense. Also, it's from what I understand, it wasn't all spiritual and religious. There were a lot of kind of social engineering things that Plethon was trying to reconstruct as well.
Yes, that's true. And in some respects, that is maybe not as unusual as you might think. Really, he was working in the tradition of the ancient philosophers, who in many cases were also lawgivers, nomothetai. And if you look at, for instance, the stories about Pythagoras, he organized communities, and he lectured Greeks, especially in Italy, about how they should organize their societies. So many of the ancient philosophers, Parmenides is another one.
Right.
Plato went to the tyrant of Syracuse to try and get him to organize a state. So this is a long tradition, especially in the Platonic tradition, of philosophers being lawgivers. And why not? They're in touch with the gods. They presumably, as philosophers, understand social structures and human psychology and knowledge. And philosophy, ancient philosophy, is about how to live. And that's also about how to live in society. And so Plethon was really writing in the tradition of Plato's Republic and Plato's Laws. And probably he called his book the Book of Laws in direct emulation of Plato's laws, nomoi in both cases. So for a philosopher to be presenting a religion and also a social system was not really atypical. So also, I mean, it was just the particular cultural context of Plethon as well. Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks 2 years after Plethon died. And so the Byzantine Empire was under constant threat from the Ottomans. Greece, had been under Frankish rule. And so he saw that Hellenic culture, I think, was really under threat. And in fact, some of his other works are, and this was really his job too, was as an advisor to the rulers. He gave advice on all sorts of things about how best to protect the state. And so he was very much a student of history and oracles even, and he would look back at those and try and give what we would call political or even military advice. He talked about how to fortify the Peloponnese, for example. He took his role as a sort of advisor or philosophical advisor to the state very seriously, I think. And so as part of that, he did lay down in his Book of Laws, literal laws about, inheritance and marriage and punishment of various offenses and so forth. Some of that survives, and some of it is a little bit hair-raising because it's medieval. I can't say in terms of his social consciousness, he was much beyond medieval thinking. But he tried to give philosophical arguments for how to organize the state, I guess I would say. And, I think because, in some sense, Scholarius probably didn't disagree so much with that stuff. That's some of the stuff he burned, but some of it does survive. And I included, of course, because it's part of what survives, but it's not really essential in any way, or even, I think, very closely connected with the religion, which is, I think, the most interesting part of what Plethon has done.
Sure.
And the calendar too, really.
Right. And it's really ironic and funny that in the same way that kind of the church fathers, in attempts to wipe out like the Gnostic thought, they actually preserved it in their writings.
That's right. They would probably be horrified if they knew.
Exactly. Along those same lines of what you were talking about as far as kind of state involvement, can you maybe speak briefly about his role in the Council of Florence? Because that's pretty interesting too.
Yes. So I think the general agreement now is that he didn't have a big role. He went along with the Greek delegation. So in case your listeners don't know, the Council of Florence was convened to try and reunite the Western and Eastern branches of the Christian Church, basically the Roman Catholic and the Greek Orthodox branches, which of course are still separated. But there were a number of what to an outsider looks like kind of ridiculous doctrinal differences between the two branches of the church. Anyway, they would convene this grand council to try and reunite the branches. So Plethon, as a philosopher, as a lay philosopher, went along with the Greek delegation. He was living in Mistras in the Peloponnese at this time, where he spent the last part of his life. And he was quite old by this time. So that was in 1438. And so he was probably in his 80s. We don't know exactly when he was born, but he's probably in his 80s. So he sailed to Ferrara, I believe, first in 1438, and the Roman delegation came up from Rome, and they moved the council to Florence in 1439 for not quite clear reasons. Partly it seems to have been the plague, but so we had all of these church officials from the eastern and western branches meeting to try and decide if they could reach some sort of unification. I mean, part of this again was had to do with the politics that the eastern Byzantine half of the Roman Empire was being assaulted by the Ottoman Turks, and they needed support from various cities more to the west, Italian cities and others. And so they wanted to get, there was some negotiating. Well, if you accept these things, then we'll send you some ships to try and protect Constantinople. And so most people think he really didn't care because he was a pagan. His sympathies were more with the Greeks, and so he didn't like some of the Roman ideas being sort of imported into the Greek church. And he thought, as a philosopher, Plato was much superior to Aristotle. And in the Greek, Plato tended to be preferred as a sort of a pagan predecessor to the Christian religion, whereas in the West, they were more happy with Aristotle because he didn't challenge the Roman Catholic doctrine so much. And so that was another reason he didn't like the Western Christian church. And so he went to Florence and gave some lectures. And he, in particular, a very important lecture of his survives, or sort of a monograph called On the Differences of Plato from Aristotle, and where he basically lays out what he thinks Aristotle got wrong, and also, by implication, what the Western philosophers got wrong about Plato, and because they were following Aristotle. And I should say that very few works of Plato were known in the West at this time. I'm just trying to remember what, I know that Timaeus was one, but I think there were only like two of Plato's dialogues that had been translated into Latin and were generally known. And so people just had a very sort of indirect knowledge. People in the West, Latin speakers in the West, had a very indirect knowledge of Plato. So anyway, the sort of the consensus of scholars seems to be he went along. He really didn't care too much about the Council of Unification, and gave these lectures on the superiority, really, of Plato over Aristotle. And so the story goes that Cosimo de' Medici heard some of these lectures and was very excited by them, and vowed that he would found a Platonic academy. And approximately 30 years later, he did. He founded the Platonic Academy in Florence and put Marsilio Ficino in charge of it. And because by then Constantinople had fallen and many scholars had fled Byzantium, bringing Greek manuscripts with them, including the works of Plato, and also, of course, the Corpus Hermeticum and many of the Neoplatonists. So they brought all of these manuscripts with them, but they were all written in Greek, which not so many people could read in the West. And so one of the things Cosimo de' Medici did is he said to Marsilio Ficino, "You start translating this Greek stuff." And he started him, according to the story, started him working on Plato, but then when he found out about the Corpus Hermeticum, he said, well, this is even more important, so you do the Corpus Hermeticum first, which he did. And so, of course, Ficino translated many of these works into Latin for the first time and made them much more available in the West. And, arguably, I think, you can quibble about effects, but arguably this was an important part of essentially seeding the Italian Renaissance, because there was this sudden fusion into Italy and into the West in general of especially Platonic ideas that so transformed art and music and just thinking in general. And of course, sort of the whole esoteric tradition too that came out of the Florentine Renaissance. So I credit Plethon with this because, in a sense, it was Plethon that inspired Cosimo de' Medici to found the Florentine Academy. And we know that Ficino translated some of Plethon's works too, not the Book of Laws, as it turns out, but some of his other works on the Chaldean oracles and some other things. Indirectly, I think a very important figure in terms of sort of the Western spiritual tradition. Nice.
And yeah, I know people are familiar with Ficino and Medici, but may not really make that connection with Plethon. So I think that's definitely valuable to kind of get that out there for sure. Janice, I know you had some questions. I don't want to hog the mic. Are you there?
So I wanted to touch on a couple of things here. I think one of the important things about the book you published is its practicality. Often these subjects, while intriguing, whether we're talking about Plethon or we're talking about Renaissance Neoplatonists, or even Iamblichus for that matter, a lot of the material in print is theoretical or philosophical and not practical. And I think in today's age, especially with the sort of reaction that ended up being the case towards what neo-paganism looked like in the 60s through the 80s or 90s, say, people have a deeper desire for a more authentic reconstructionist approach to things, or even just a more authentic approach to the resurrection of ancient religion outside of the sort of post-1960s paradigm of quote-unquote popular neo-paganism, which I think owes more to the hippie subculture than to actual source materials. And we're seeing a lot of that now. There's different groups. There's Hellenic groups, there's Roman groups. But I think that what you're doing with this book is important because it opens up that door to people who are seeking something more aligned with the ancient traditions, that can inform their practice in a way that is authentic. Now, I guess where I'm going with all of that is the core of the sort of religio spiritual aspect of this would be theurgy. And I was wondering if you could, in your own words, from your own perspective, sort of articulate for our listeners what theurgy is.
Yeah. So theurgy, of course, etymologically is work with the gods in some sense, as opposed to theology, which is talk about the gods. And so my definition of theurgy is techniques for interacting directly with deities in the broad sense. So that would include the higher gods and also daimons. So more spatially and temporally embodied deities. And so these are practices, I would say. So I guess that's what I would say theurgy is. And why do you do this? Well, because for one thing, to learn about the gods, but also then for more personal types of advice or interactions. The gods are involved in our lives all of the time. And to make that a smoother interaction, I would say, it helps to talk to them, in effect, or at least to communicate with them in some way. So theurgy, I would say, is a very much of a practical tool for people to interact with deities in a very direct way. It's a skill. It's not too hard to do, but it needs to be done critically, I think, and with discernment. And that's part of the training, I think, really, in terms of theurgy, is to understand how to do it well. And we do have some very valuable works. Iamblichus's De Mysteriis, as it's normally known, is a theoretical, just basically monograph on basically how theurgy works. But as Dominic mentioned, it doesn't give us so much actual ritual, so to speak, how to actually do things. We do have some good insights from the Greek magical papyri, which are, more or less contemporaneous, come from a similar Greco-Egyptian kind of background. And although they're not, some of them are theurgical, I would say, but others are, of course, just sort of practical magic. And but nevertheless, the techniques often we can figure out, we can see how people were doing, what the technology was. So that's, that's my definition of theurgy. And I do think that theurgy is really at the core of any genuine religion. I mean, this is the way people get the insights, the inspiration in a literal sense, being inspired by a deity to found a religion or to transform or reform or a religion in any way. And I think we see that in all of the religions. But it's woefully neglected in most mainstream religions. And I think, where we do have a lot of documentation about theurgy is in the Neoplatonic tradition, because especially the Neoplatonists, all of the Neoplatonists really, were fighting a battle against Christianity. So they were, in a sense, needed to revitalize the pagan religion. And so they were sort of, I think, more actively working theurgic practices, in the 3rd, 4th, 5th, on through the 6th centuries, to revitalize the pagan religion. And that's why we find, in sort of that late paganism, sort of the fullest development of the ancient pagan religions. But theurgy goes back, theurgy goes back into the shamanic traditions, probably in the Greek world to the 7th century BCE, if not before that. And I think, there's good evidence that theurgic practices were practiced all along through Greek religion, but it was not called that. The term theurgy is late, probably it was called just divination, Montaigne, earlier in the Greek religious tradition. So it includes. Go ahead. Yeah.
I was going to say, there does seem to be a manifestation of what you're talking about in the shamanic sense, in like the Hyperborean, Apollonian current of theurgy that speaks about Abaris and things like that. Would you say that's right?
Yes, exactly. That's right. And so those stories, that we've got about Pythagoras, and actually about many of the pre-Socratics, once you're familiar with theurgy and you read those things, you say, oh, okay, that's what they were doing. That makes sense out of this story, flying on a golden arrow, as Abaris did. Parmenides, journeying to the underworld to have a conversation, a lesson really with Persephone. These are theurgical operations. And when you read them with a background in theurgy, it just, it seems so familiar. You can just really understand what they're doing. And of course, this is why, so much, previous work on the pre-Socratics especially, kind of misses the point, because they were very rationalist philosophers reading these texts, trying to read them like modern philosophy texts. And, they're, of course, most of them, or many of them, are written in verse. They're poetic. They couldn't believe them to be literally true. And so they just kind of were not able to interpret them very well. But I think, Parmenides certainly, Heraclitus, the whole Pythagorean tradition, a lot of the stuff in Plato, really, can be understood better from a theurgical perspective. Where is this stuff coming from? Well, they tell you it's coming from the gods, but they mean that literally, that they're going on if you like, a shamanic journey to interact with these beings. And they're getting inspired then with what they later write down. And I think,
John, I do have a question for you then, because I became familiar with your work probably like 20 years ago or something through your website, Bibliotheca Arcana.
Mm-hmm.
And I was floored because for the first time I felt like I saw someone in our current time who seemed to understand theurgy from the inside, and who seemed to have, based upon what I saw on the material you have on there, seemed to have had some direct theophanic experiences that motivated them to go on this path. And so I guess my question for you, as somebody who not only has been a scholar for decades of this, but a practitioner, is what is the ultimate purpose of theurgy?
Well, it sounds kind of trite, perhaps, but I would say it's to live better, and if you believe there are gods, and if you believe they have some effect in our world, it's easier to live better if you have some interaction with them. If you know what they have in mind for you or for the world at large, you don't have to just accept that. I mean, part of what I think is very important in the theurgic tradition is it's a two-way interaction. You may argue with the gods. You may say, I don't, okay, that's what you've had in mind, but I don't like that. I don't think that's right. And, what else, how can we work this out? How can we negotiate some way forward that satisfies what the God wants to happen and what we want to happen? And so I think that's, in a sort of a superficial sense, that helps you to live better. People will say, the God hit me over the head with a 2x4 or something because, sent me so many signals about what I was supposed to be doing, and I wasn't listening. And finally, they had to send me a sign that I couldn't ignore. And so it's much easier if you don't have to be hit with the 2x4. And also if you can maybe negotiate how things are going to go as well. So I think it is, in fact, a valuable life skill. And I think that this, goes back to the idea that philosophy is a way of life, and it's to help you to live better. And different philosophers had different ways, different ideas about how to do that. The Epicureans and the Stoics and the Platonists, for example, had quite different ideas. But the important thing about the Platonic path, and this is sort of the Apollonian path as well, is that the gods are an important part of that. And so that any sort of way of interacting with the gods and communicating with the gods can help that process along, whether it's divination in some sort of mechanical way, casting knuckle bones or whatever, or whether it's a theurgic ascent to union with the gods in a more profound way. These things can all help you to live better because, among other things, you understand the world better and you understand your place in the world better. So I think that's why these practices are important, and why the ancient philosophers taught them, and why it was really a central part of their religious practice in many of these traditions. The Neoplatonists, Orphics, the Gnostics as well, and in some Muslim and Christian and Jewish traditions as well, and in outside the Western world. I find a lot of parallels between Neoplatonic theurgy and practices in Tibetan Buddhism.
Yes.
So, I think, the basic technology, if you will, or the science underneath the techniques is the same, worldwide, because we're all people. And so it gets packaged in different cultural ways, but the basic ideas are the same.
Okay. And can you you touched on it a little bit with the Greek magical papyri, but a lot of times there seems like there's this stark contrast between thaumaturgy and theurgy. And you see figures like, I know we're talking about Plethon, but even with Jesus, obviously you can say he was practicing theurgy, but you can also say he was practicing miracles, thaumaturgy. And you see that with Proclus, Iamblichus, a lot of the Neoplatonists. And so from your perspective, the dynamic between thaumaturgy and theurgy, how do you see it?
Well, I think, this is like one of those distinctions that scholars like to make, partly because they're embarrassed by magic. Mm-hmm. And so they want to somehow draw a line between magic and quote unquote legitimate religion or legitimate spiritual practices. And of course, the answer is there is no real hard line between the two. I think, that the outcome of a operation, let me say, an operation of this sort that you're seeking can be, are you there? I seem to have lost everybody.
I'm here. Yeah, I don't know what's going on with Janice. He's in and out. I think Zoom crashed on him, but continue. Sorry.
Okay, good. So I think that, your goals can be more materialistic or more concrete or more personal and individual, or they can be, higher in the sense that they're more geared toward your spiritual development or geared towards the good of the community or the world as a whole. So we've got a whole range of possible goals, which, we might consider more selfish or more enlightened, perhaps. But it's a continuum, I think. It's strictly speaking a continuum. And, we know that certainly part of ancient practice was calling on the gods to do things that we would consider bad, coercing somebody to have sex with you, or to, have an accident in a chariot race, or to get sick and die. People prayed to the gods for these things, and people still pray to Yahweh and the monotheistic gods as well for these things today as well. Mm-hmm. So I think it really is a continuum. Now I do think that where there is some worthwhile distinction to be made is that I think in many of the ancient philosophies, certainly in Platonism, also really even in Stoicism as well, is that and in Gnosticism, I think I would also agree, is that there's is that when you become, I think, I'll say, philosophically enlightened, which is kind of perhaps an overblown way of expressing it. But let me just say, philosophically, you've learned some of the lessons of philosophy, then you do see that these very personal goals are in a context of the wider good, the larger mm-hmm. good. And so in that sense, what you might be doing these operations for tends to shift from, I want some money, or I need some money, to how can I make this a better world where maybe I also have some more money, but, the real problem is to make it a world that works better for everybody. And so I think in the process of what I'll call spiritual or philosophical enlightenment, there tends to be a shift from more personal goals, which we might think of more as thaumaturgy, to more spiritual goals that we might think of more as theurgy. But in terms of the technique, there's really no difference. And I think it is a continuum, and, I think, and if with a certain level of philosophical enlightenment, there's certainly nothing wrong in trying to make things better for yourself personally, whether it's more money or better health or whatever it might be. I don't see that a theurgist would not, interact with the gods for that, like, talking to the gods and saying, well, why is it, I never have any money, for example, or why do I have these health problems, and what can I do about them, and getting some advice from the deities about that, and maybe working with them, would be a way of solving some of those problems.
Well, let me ask you something in relation to that. You're speaking about asking the deities, getting their perspective. So, there's a big problem, I think, in especially in American culture, because of the inheritance of evangelical Christianity and Protestantism, and the idea of and this is not in any way a criticism of Jesus, because I have no criticisms of him, but the idea of this personal Jesus that you hear talking to you in your head. And we see this imported into American neo-paganism, where people have these gross and kind of embarrassing misunderstandings where they think that they had contact with the deity, when in reality they were simply interacting with their own discursive intellect or active imagination. Mm-hmm. An epiphany of the deity is an unmistakable manifestation. And yet it takes effort and work, and it doesn't seem to happen to everyone. So when you're saying, asking them for their perspective or asking them to communicate with you, this is through a ritual format, or through divination, or through dreams. I mean, how would you say that the gods communicate their will for you, to you, when you ask for this kind of guidance?
Well, really, all of those, and those were all traditional ways of communicating with the gods as well. So dreams occasionally, divination. I do a variety of different systems, and sort of direct theurgical rituals based on Neoplatonism. So I think that part of the problem that and I think it's a very important and serious problem that you've pointed to. Part of the problem is, for a monotheist, if somebody talks to them, so to speak, in their head, because they've only got one God, really, it has to be either that God, or it has to be a demon of some sort, some nefarious figure. And so they don't really have a mindset for dealing with the huge multiplicity of figures that may be communicating with you. And I think, in a polytheistic context, people understand, or at least people that have some experience in theurgy understand, that when you invoke a deity, that deity may not arrive. Some other deity may arrive. Some lesser being, a daimon, may arrive. Or some component of your subconscious may arise. And so you, in a sense, cannot take any of these interactions at face value as gospel, so to speak. So you've always got a critical attitude about, okay, I'm talking to some independent personality. It's independent of my discursive reason and my conscious thinking. It's some other being that has some things to talk to me about, and you have to take that into account, and to be critical, I think. So this is I think you're also alluding to what we sometimes call UPG, unverified personal gnosis. Okay, I had this grand epiphany of whoever came to me and told me just how things are. Well, okay, fine, but we have to understand some being came to you, some being interacted with your subtle body, perhaps, would be Plethon's version of how this works, interacted with your subtle body, and this was filtered through your imagination, and you had these experiences with this being. So there's a lot of potential for contamination there. You don't really know who you were communicating with anyway. This is why Iamblichus gives a lot of sort of guidelines about how do you know what kind of being you're communicating with. So, you have to seek verification, and that can be verification from the god or whoever it was you were communicating with, or it could be verification from other people that are doing theurgic rituals, or it could be verification from material reality. And so I think that one thing about theurgical training is to make you very skeptical of these interactions. They're important, but it's a potentially very noisy channel that they're coming through. A noisy channel from a not very clearly identified source. And so you have to kind of take them from that perspective. And this is part of the interaction, is to say, oh, wait a minute, why should I believe this? What you're telling me, or I don't believe what you're telling me, and to try and go from there. And I think that that's a part of what's missing from a lot of the evangelical types of communities is they do just think they can kneel down and pray, and whatever comes into their head, that's the gospel, quote unquote, gospel truth, and they can go with that. And I think in traditions that have a established theurgical tradition, whatever it may be called, that there's a lot of preliminary training to first of all to give you that level of discernment, and again, just knowing you're in a polytheistic context where there's lots of beings that might be communicating with you at all sorts of levels in sort of the hierarchy, if you like, of divine beings, gives you a certain degree of skepticism right there. So while I think that these communications are always important and relevant for you as an individual and should be taken seriously, nevertheless, they should be treated critically and, again, with discernment, to use that old word, and not assumed to have really any implications for other people unless there is some sort of verification. If a lot of divinations and theurgical operations are independently coming up with the same thing, well, then you've got a better basis, and you can sort of filter out the personal stuff. And so maybe Apollo talks to me. Well, some other pagan who doesn't worship that pantheon, they're going to get a communication from somebody else. So that's going to be one difference right there. But the way it comes also could be quite different. So it's something I worry about, because I hear that evangelicals especially, or there's prophets popping up all over the place with all sorts of prophecies, many of which seem to be just their own wishful thinking. But that's a problem. It's a problem for anyone that claims communication with the gods.
Right, and that's probably nothing new either. From the perspective of Plethon, and of course your own perspective, you talked about prerequisites to kind of being able to filter out all the noise. Does Plethon say anything specifically in those 16 chapters that we have on how to kind of build that spiritual vision?
Well, so yeah, he has, in a sense, quite a lot to say, but in another sense, not so much. So I should say that, in fact, Plethon writes nothing about theurgy, as near as I can tell. In his commentary on the Chaldean oracles, he seems to allude to theurgy in a few places. But the Book of Laws, at least the surviving parts, has nothing that I would call theurgy. He does list Iamblichus and also Porphyry as in his golden chain. So, and he obviously had read them very closely, but neither from the chapter headings or from the surviving text does he seem to say anything about theurgy. So, what does that mean? I think it means a couple things. We really don't know if he practiced any sort of theurgy himself. He claims that his, he doesn't claim any sort of divine inspiration. And in fact, he was accused of that, that some Scholarius and some of his other critics said, oh, he changed his name to Plethon because he's trying to make us think he's Plato reincarnated. Well, no, he's not. He's saying this religion, it's all rationally based on philosophy. It's, based on the philosophy of my predecessors, all of whom he lists. And he even says in one place, anybody starting from these premises would really kind of reach the same theology, at least, that he reaches. Obviously, the rituals might not be the same because they're somewhat arbitrary. So his is a very much of a rational religion. And I do have a chapter on theurgy because I think it's important in the book. But I try and make very clear that it's based on Iamblichus and some of Plethon's sources, and we really have no reason to believe that he was practicing theurgy. But on the other hand, in the grand scheme of things that could get you tortured and executed, theurgy was right up at the top of the list. So he would have kept that very, very secret had he been practicing it. So, I think I'm not sure if I've answered your question or not, but in some ways it's a very non-theurgical Hellenic religion that he presents. Mm-hmm. He's got rituals, for invoking the gods, and they do kind of follow Neoplatonic theurgical ideas, but I wouldn't call them theurgic practices. They're not spells or specific sorts of rituals like that. They're more like traditional religious rituals.
So let me ask you this. So as you may or may not know, our podcast is dedicated to Hermes, and so in the context of what you're describing, what would a rite in the life of somebody who's practicing this way, what would just a rite to invoke Hermes and seek his blessing look like in this context?
So it would, all his rituals have pretty much the same format. And I can describe a little bit about, later about, how these fit into the whole calendar year and everything. But there's an initial invocation, a triple adoration as it's called, of Zeus as the highest god, and then of the Olympian gods, and then of all of the other gods. So there are sort of three salutations that take place to the gods in general. Then typically there would be a long invocation, and most of his invocations are to groups of gods. But the basic principles of constructing the invocations are basically follow Neoplatonic principles. So that would be calling on the god by various names that the god is known by, names and epithets. So for Hermes, for example, then citing some functions of that deity within the religion. So now in traditional Greek prayer, that would often cite, for instance, myths that, for example, where Hermes had helped some person in the past, either individually or mythologically, and so given guidance, for example, or helped somebody understand something. But also it could include where reminding the god where they have helped you in the past, you as a person. And so now in Plethon case, though, the gods have somewhat different functions than they do in traditional mythology. And so Hermes in particular is the god that oversees the daimons. So he would be invoked as the leader and the creator of the souls of daimons. And that would probably, you would mention those functions of Hermes. Then you might ask for a request of the deity. So now in the case of Hermes, again, because in Plethon's system, his primary function is as the creator of the souls of the daimons, you might ask him for some aid if you're dealing with some particular daimons and ask him for some aid in that regard, whether it's making contact with a particular daimon or helping you negotiate with a particular daimon or whatever it might be. Now Plethon is very insistent in his religious system that all of the daimons are beneficial. There's no such things as evil daimons in his system. But that doesn't mean they're doing what you want. And so in that sense, you might negotiate with Hermes to basically say, hey, get your guys in order here and help me out. And, and then some thanks, thanks for, and promises, vows, again, as in traditional. His prayers are in some sense quite traditional, but it's a citation. What connects you with the deity is offerings connected with that deity. But in Plethon's cases, it's not sacrificing an animal or even necessarily burning incense or something like that. It's verbal connections with the deity. So citing the deity's functions, theological functions, and ways that they've helped in the past. So it's a verbal connection with that particular deity. Again, kind of consistent with Plethon's overall kind of rationalistic approach to religion. Oh, and a hymn. I forgot to mention a hymn. Then, a hymn, you would sing a hymn that might be especially devoted to that god. And there is, for each of the Olympian deities, there's a hymn devoted to that deity.
So say, and it seems to follow the general earlier Indo-European form of prayer then, because you have first you're starting with the appellations like Hermes Eriunios, Hermes Charadotes, Hermes Argifantes, Hermes Chryserapis, and just keep going with that. Hermes Maiados Weos, and then you'd move into Hear Me Hermes, Cattle Rustler, Bringer of Dreams, Watcher by Night, Silver Tongue, Glory of Heaven, Prince of Arcadia, Maya's Son, Aid of Heroes such as Odysseus, whose minister is Heracles, hear my voice, O blessed and righteous one. And then you'd move into you who conduct the souls back and forth and who communicate messages from Olympos and who delight in the agora and the gymnasium. Hear my voice, O Lord. And then you might say the Orphic prayer to Hermes. And then you might ask, O Lord, please send forth a daimon to assist me with this matter, or please aid me in such and such a way. And then you would give thanks. And then you would say, oh Lord, if you help me with this matter, I will publicly thank you or make a donation to a school or something like that.
Yeah, perfect. Now here's one important difference though. Plethon is following the old Platonic idea that the poets told lies about the gods. So that the Neoplatonists, especially many philosophers, were in the business of providing metaphorical interpretations of the traditional myths. The castration of Ouranos and so forth. Plato had famously said, in his ideal state, throw out all of the poets because they tell all these lies about the gods. And so Plethon really is following up on that. And he's saying, well, that's true, and the philosophers can tell us the truth about the gods. And so his religion is based on what he understands the philosophers to have said about the gods. So many of those traditional myths he would reject as basically misleading and pernicious lies. So now he does cite some of the myths, and he, in some of his assignments of the functions to the gods, he seems to be alluding to some of these myths as well. So I'll give you a specific example, that Dionysus is the god that oversees self-moving things. So in a philosophical sense, things with souls. And this seems to be an allusion back to, and again, it all comes from Plato ultimately, but, that the Plato's statement that the Thyrsus carriers are many, but the Bacchae are few, that a person whose soul has been reunited after the Titans carved it up, and boiled it. The heart was rescued, and Athena took the heart to Zeus, and Zeus sewed it in his thigh or whatever, and it was reborn as Dionysus. So as a divine type of soul. So this is a process that we all go through. This is the Orphic process, of reuniting our soul and divinizing our soul. Well, he seems to be alluding to that in what he says about Dionysus, but he doesn't tell that myth, and that myth is not explicitly cited, in the hymn to Dionysus. So that's the only difference, is he would be very selective in what myths he cited in his prayer, because some of the myths might be compatible with the philosophical understanding of that deity, like, for example, the Orphic myths, but other myths he would consider, just bad stories, and it would be sort of insulting to the god, if you like, to really, and wouldn't connect with the god, because what you're trying to do is use these stories to connect with a particular deity. This is how you try and control who you're actually talking to. And if you use the wrong story, well, it's going to miss the mark. It's going to get you nobody, or it's going to get you some random daimon or something. So
that's such an important piece of advice you just gave, because I feel like what you're saying is essentially that the myths themselves are a technical method of communication that evokes the qualities of the god that you're trying to connect with symbolically. Would you say that's correct?
That's exactly right. Now, you can interpret them metaphorically, and that metaphorical interpretation can be the connection. I've actually just written a chapter on theurgy where I use an invocation of Athena in exactly that way, and it's from Proclus, actually. Proclus, in his hymn to Athena, cites a number of the myths, but they're clearly given a metaphorical interpretation, which is what he's after, because he's like the contest with Poseidon over Athens, and I'm just trying to remember what other ones he mentions, but Proclus's hymns, there's 7 surviving hymns, are a really good example of using the myths with a metaphorical interpretation to basically make the connection you want. Now, again, Plethon is not so willing to do that. He is less willing to use the traditional myths, because I think he says, in fact, they're too likely to be misinterpreted by I forget the term he uses, but the unschooled or the uneducated. So he's really trying to come up with a religion which is not just for a bunch of philosophers, but it's for this community that he's defining in his Book of Laws. So he's, trying to come up with a popular church, if you like. And so he doesn't want to do things that are going to mislead people. I guess, crudely, they don't want them going out castrating their father just because, that's what Kronos did, so it must be okay.
Hey, John, how do you feel about that? Because I could see where taking those myths as literal could lead people into kind of a fundamental worldview, a fundamental path, similar to how you see, not that we want to knock Christians, but how Christian fundamentalists take these literal things way too literally. Do you feel like that was kind of the direction he was going with what you're talking about, as far as the metaphorical interpretations being a little bit too problematic potentially for the masses? Does that make sense?
Makes perfect sense to me. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
No,
do
I
you think that's where,
exactly. I mean,
yeah.
I think the most dangerous aspect of fundamentalist religions is they take everything literally, and stuff that was not intended to be taken literally. And I think he was well aware of that problem, living as he did in Byzantium, and with these seeing these two versions of the Christian religion, fighting it out and trying to reconcile some of these issues, which largely arise from a too literal reading of what's interpreted as a sacred text. I mean, I think it's important to point out in Platon's religion, there is no sacred text. There's neither his book of laws nor any of the other predecessors that he cites are treated as sacred texts. It has to make sense, I guess is from Platon's perspective. Now, again, that's somewhat different from the Neoplatonists we think about, Iamblichus and Proclus, and those are more willing to embrace the non-rational aspects of this, I think, than Plethon is, at least in his public religion. Again, this was intended to be a religion for the masses, so to speak. What he may have done on his own, or with his few close students, is hard to tell.
Right. Yeah, I don't know that Iamblichus is on the mysteries was meant for the masses necessarily.
I don't think so. Yeah,
right.
No, I really don't think so. And, we know these, especially by that time, these Neoplatonic groups were, quite small and isolated and besieged. So it was a very select audience you're dealing with there.
Well, I have another question. This is a little bit more of a direct, kind of simple answered one, but, today in our modern age, people are, in the West especially, just so overwhelmed by the egoistic, analytical, rational, discursive intellect and the sort of inheritance from the Enlightenment and Protestantism that they have trouble getting out of their head. Even people who want to explore things like we've been discussing, they tend to rationalize a lot of it, even when they're practicing it. And this can be an obstacle to the direct experience of theophany. So, simply put, would you say the gods, can they be known and experienced directly on their own terms, as they are in themselves, as opposed to our own mental projection or rationalistic ideation?
Well, I certainly think they can be experienced or known independent of our rational ideation. On the other hand, I think they will always be known, or are always known, mediated by our physical embodiment. And now, Plethon argues that we have an immortal soul with an ethereal vehicle, which sticks with it, which is kind of a semi-physical thing, and that we're then that soul is periodically bound into a mortal physical body. And but it's the higher part of that, what in ancient Greek philosophy is called the nous, the supra-rational mind, I would call it. It's the mind that knows the Platonic forms directly without thinking about them, so to speak, without analyzing them rationally. And so most of the Neoplatonists, including Plethon, would say our nous can have some direct contact with the gods. And I think, in some respects, he believes that we can know more about the gods than, for example, some of the other Neoplatonists would acknowledge. So in that sense, he grants a little more human power, cognitive or epistemological power, than Proclus or Iamblichus would. But it's this higher part of the soul above the rational part. The anoia is the sort of the discursive reason, where we think things through and talk to ourselves and so forth. But the nous is a higher faculty, and that's the part that is really of the same nature as the gods, and therefore can have some direct contact with the gods and know it. But nevertheless, that's then we have some experience of that, and that's mediated by the rest of this whole package. It's we think about it and talk about it to ourselves even, and try and understand it in conceptual terms. That's with our lower discursive reason, and again, it's especially for the lower beings, the daimons. Plutarch basically says that they interact with our subtle body. Their subtle body interacts with our subtle body. So it's sort of a mediated interaction as well. So we can have those direct experiences, but because they're supra-rational of their nature, they have a sort of ineffability. We can't really describe them in words or really even conceptualize them to ourselves, because immediately when we try and say, oh, well, what was that light, or what was that sudden feeling of euphoria and union? Well, now you're putting words on it, euphoria and union and light and so forth. And so you're now, dealing with it with a lower level of your mind. And it's not direct anymore. Now it's mediated by all of these words and concepts we're using to try and understand it. So yes, we can have these direct experiences, but then we have to deal with them. We have to try and make some sense out of it. And then we're back in our limited and fallible minds. And this is why philosophers talked about these stuff. The Neoplatonists would go and do their theurgical rites and have their experiences, but then they had to try and figure out what it all meant. And, if you see, for instance, Proclus's, his elaborate hierarchies of all of the gods, well, that's him trying to make sense out of the experiences that he had. And also, to try and interpret it in terms of Platonic doctrine and also the experiences that his fellow theurgists had. And Iamblichus too, all of that stuff that's in De Mysteriis, it's trying to make sense out of these fundamentally ineffable sorts of experiences that they had. And so I think, like with divination, you get a dream or you get a result, an oracular response, then you have to make sense out of it. And that's a very error-prone process. And that's where you have to have a lot of humility and say, well, I really don't understand what's going on here. This is the best sense I can make out of it. And I have to sort of provisionally go on and, see if I'm right or wrong about this, or maybe I'll never know, And I think, again, that's where, some people that have not had theurgical training can get misled because they have an experience and they think they know what it means. And, they don't, that's just your first guess, or that's just, projecting their own wishful thinking onto it. This is why theurgy in many traditions, and I'm thinking of Eastern traditions as well as Western traditions, is not something that people get taught right off the bat. This is, after some years of rather intense practice and education, to put it all in the right context so you can deal in a healthy way with the results of the experiences. And in that sense, it's no different from drug-induced spiritual experiences. You can't just take a drug and expect to have a spiritually enlightening experience. There's set and setting, to set the proper environment and also the proper training and expectations to encourage an experience that then will have some spiritual insight, bring some spiritual insight.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, that was kind of what I was getting at earlier about the prerequisites to having an authentic experience or perceiving it as authentically as possible. And I guess these things can only really be perceived through our, it's all perceived through our biases and, where we are mentally at any given time. So, I mean, that's something to consider, that the gods are going to be kind of dressed up in the clothes that we provide them in our mind. And, someone in late Greco Egypt is going to see Jupiter or Zeus dressed more in those clothing, literally, than someone in an earlier, Greek context. So, all things to consider for sure.
Yeah, one of the Chaldean oracles says that explicitly. We put on these forms for your benefit.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And epiphanies that I've been involved with other people, where Athena appeared, in one case in being driven in a limousine, and not dressed up, with a helmet and all the rest. So yes, absolutely. These are, and this is why, Iamblichus says that the higher gods appear as, balls of light, or it's not clear exactly what he's saying, but, they don't appear as people, they don't look like people. In a sense, that's when the theurgist doesn't need the crutch, if you like, of a easier to relate to appearance. But we know how to relate to people, right? So it's very reasonable for the gods to appear to us like people. Because we can read body language and expressions, and we know how they talk and so forth. So I think it's a very reasonable thing. But it's important to keep this all in mind. And this is also, let me mention one other thing. This is why, in living long-lasting theurgical traditions, of course, there's a, I'll say guru-student relationship too, because then when somebody who's learning theurgy or beginning with theurgy, if they have an experience, they can go to their teacher and say, well, what about this? And the teacher can help them sort through all of this and, talk about, how to interpret it. And that's, I think, a very important part of learning to do this. Like most skills, it's best taught experientially and with a sort of oral tradition, one-on-one. And we know that the ancient philosophical schools operated this way. There were group sessions where people could talk about their dreams and, different things like that. But then there was also one-on-one instruction where people could talk about their experiences and get, specific guidance on what to do next. And I think this is what, helped ancient theurgists steer clear from some of the traps that lie, that are potentially in these sorts of spiritual practices.
Mm-hmm. So that leads me to one, maybe one final question for you on my part, at least. That is the daimon in the context of this, the daimon, or the genius, one could say. First of all, does Plethon touch on this at all in any of his work? And second of all, in your own personal understanding, what is the role of the daimon in this kind of theurgical work?
Okay, so Plethon has a hierarchical system of gods. So Zeus is the top god, and then there's the Olympian gods, which are Platonic forms. Essentially, they're outside of time and space. They're eternal in a completely timeless sense. Then there are the celestial gods. I said Olympian gods. I made a mistake. I meant super celestial gods, who are outside of time and space. And they're essentially Platonic forms. Then there are the celestial gods, which are, I would say, symbolized by the 7 visible planets. Of course, he lived in a pre-Copernican world, so he thought they all went around the Earth. But these are lesser gods that are in time and space, but they're essentially everlasting. They, from his perspective, continue on forever. But they're, in the heavens. And then on Earth, there are the daimons. He calls them sometimes just daimons, sometimes terrestrial daimons. And as I mentioned before, he insists that they're all good because they're emanations ultimately of Zeus, who is good. So all of the gods are good because they're all emanations of Zeus, who is good. So this is sort of standard Platonism. There's a lot of nuance to talk about. Well, what does exactly mean that everything is good? But I'll leave that aside. So the daimon's job is basically pretty much like in traditional Middle Platonism. They are assistants to the gods. They help carry out the gods' functions on Earth. So the super celestial gods are outside of time and space. So in effect, they need surrogates operating in time and space to carry out what they do, to fulfill their functions. And that's what the daimons do. So now some of his detailed chapters on the daimons were destroyed. So we don't know exactly what he said about them. But as I said, he insisted that they're basically the lowest rank of daimons above us. He says they're the lowest immortal beings above humans, and they're divine and good. So we have to look at his sources for about the daimons, and I have a section in my book which is basically reconstructing what he might have said about the daimons, and it's mostly from Plutarch and Chalcidius as well, and a few other sources, which are all sources we know he used. And, they pretty much have the same idea that daimons are good, but they deal with us directly. So we have a personal daimon, the guardian daimon that Plato talks about. There's daimons that, help the plants grow and help animals breed and do their thing. And, so the daimonion of Socrates is of course, his guardian. So probably a little higher rank than the rest of us. Plotinus also had a guardian spirit that was of a higher rank than the daimons that most of us have. So there's a whole classification of daimons that, again, mostly comes from other sources, from Plutarch and Chalcidius, and Porphyry also has something to say about daimons. Porphyry admits the possibility of evil daimons, but again, Plethon doesn't think there are any of those. And he gives arguments as to why there aren't any. So there's lots of them, and also we know from Plutarch and also Apuleius that daimons often go by the names of the gods they serve. So this, again, is an important part of theurgy. If you call Athena, for example, and a being shows up and says, "Hi, I'm Athena," well, okay, but maybe it's a daimon serving Athena, who is therefore calling herself Athena. Well, that's fine. That's the way it ought to be, because the daimons are what essentially interact with things in space and time, and that's us. And so that's perfectly reasonable for one of Athena's daimons to show up and say, "Hi, I'm Athena." It also could be some other daimon that wants to interact with you and says, "Hi, I'm Athena." So that's again where that critical attitude becomes important. So lots of daimons, personal daimons, but also lots of others that are not particularly associated with us. The ancient Greeks had an idea of oikeoi daimones. In other words, personal spirits, you might even say familiar spirits, that we all have a set of them that, know us because they're in interaction with our subtle bodies, and so they know the contents of our mind. It's very reasonable, I think, to think of them as parts of our unconscious mind, parts of our subconscious, because they go around with us. They know what's in our heads, both consciously and unconsciously, and they have important interactions with us. So I think that's very reasonable to interpret them, some parts of our subconscious minds. How's that?
I think that was great. No, thank you very much. we've been going for a while now. That might be a good place to start to kind of wrap things up. Definitely appreciate your time and all the education you've given us. Where could people find out kind of news about what you're doing and what you're up to? You do have a new book out, Secret Texts of Hellenic Polytheism. So where can people find you?
Okay, so the best way to find me is I have a website, opsopaus.com. And so that's opsopaus.com. And I have information there on my my latest book. You just mentioned Secret Texts of Hellenic Polytheism. I have a page where I have resources for use with the book, help you figure out Plethon's calendar, the Greek text, if you want to see that, and also translations of his commentaries on the Chaldean oracles and some other works by him. And also, news about presentations I'm giving or classes I'm teaching, any sort of stuff like that. It also has information about my previous book, The Oracles of Apollo, on practical ancient Greek divination, and some resources to go with that. And also a link to the my old Bibliotheca Arcana website, which has a lot of my older writings and my Pythagorean tarot and stuff like that. So, but opsopaus.com will get you to all of that stuff. And people can email me from there as well. I am on Facebook. I'm not a super dedicated Facebook user, so the website's probably the best way to get access to the material and get in touch with me.
Perfect. This has been really, really great. Definitely appreciate you coming on. Janice, did you have any final words?
No, I just wanted to thank you for your time and for your excellent explication of this subject. And I just wanted to thank you. And I am hopeful that your book gets the readership it deserves. I think it's an important contribution to the development of theurgic tradition in the present, which is, I think, something that can be of ultimate benefit to people's souls.
Great. Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity and great questions. I love talking about this stuff.
Okay. That was John Opsopaus, a current exponent of the theurgic tradition in our age. I remember, 20 years ago or something, going online and finding his webpage, Bibliotheca Arcana, and being blown away. I couldn't believe that there was somebody with this much acumen and insight regarding the art of theurgy writing on a regular basis on this obscure art. I was totally impressed by the contents of that page. Tons of magical and theurgic workings abounded, philosophical writings on esoteric Pythagoreanism, interpretations of the Tarot. And he also did make a Pythagorean Tarot, which is pretty excellent. I have it. It's out of print, unfortunately, but the book that accompanies it is also excellent, even if you don't get the deck, because it's a really formidable exposition of Pythagorean doctrine, interpreted through the lens of Neoplatonic theurgy. He was a pleasure to have on the show. This was the latest installment of our theurgic series. We've had Gregory Shaw, Jeffrey Cooperman. We've had several people come on and discuss theurgy and daimons, and Angela Voss was a delightful guest. And now we have another wonderful guest. These people are often so impressive to me because they've really immersed themselves in a world that doesn't really exist anymore and have excavated these approaches to contacting the transpersonal forces of the cosmos. I was really pleased with this episode and grateful for our guest and thankful for his insights. Dom?
Yeah, no, I enjoy all perspectives on theurgy. All of our guests come at it a little bit differently, but so it's nice to hear all the different views. and he put forth some very interesting ideas. And his contribution, I think, is really valuable. I mean, this book on Plethon is going to be great, and it's just a great addition to the whole kind of theurgic, although maybe not, maybe I won't say theurgic, but this whole Neoplatonic kind of story, this chain from the classic Neoplatonists through Plethon into the Renaissance, and here we are. So yeah, it's going to be a great book. I'm really looking forward to taking a look at it. People like this who are kind of finding these obscure, forgotten texts are just real treasures, and we need to support them, really. And speaking of Jeffrey Kupperman, we had him on a few episodes back, and his book, A Theurgist's Book of Hours, it's kind of a calendar-based workbook for kind of a living theurgic praxis. His book is based on Plethon's calendar, so it's a nice connection there too.
Well, yeah, if somebody was really interested in living this life in a sincere way, they could acquire both publications and use them together to form a living practice where they're venerating the gods. And I think that an important thing to understand is the hegemony of the imperialistic form of Christianity attempted to discredit the elevated nature of pre-Christian and non-Christian religious traditions and characterize it as quote-unquote pagan, which is, of course, a Roman word which indicates, unlettered, ignorant country folk. And so it was inferred and accused that, the quote-unquote pagans simply worshipped these capricious deities who were all too similar to humans, when it was totally understood that the hieratic tradition within, I hate using the word paganism, but within the pre-Christian indigenous European religions was just as refined as and elevated as Christianity. In fact, I mean, in Byzantium integrated the Neoplatonic and Gnostic theurgic practices into Eastern Orthodox Christianity, and there were elements of that in the Western form of Christianity too. But I do feel that at least now, due to this, you continue to see theurgic practice within Eastern Christianity, and it is even called theurgy. Henosis, theosis. These things really come from the pre-Christian tradition that Plethon was attempting to resurrect. But I also think we need to be careful about nourishing biases against Christianity, because it's important to understand that the imperialistic form of Christianity is only the form that became popularized by government. There were earlier heterodox forms of Christian practice that were just as vehemently targeted by the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church, that had a great deal more in common with the Neoplatonists and Hermetists of antiquity than they had in difference. It's really interesting, in the Byzantine section of the Met Museum in New York City, you can actually see an amulet from Byzantium. It was a marriage amulet to protect a couple and to commemorate a marriage. And on one side of it, there's the Gnostic Pantheos Abraxas. So, this is, if you consider that this was it was made in gold, if you consider that this was something that was, carried on a regular basis by just a regular citizen, probably upper middle or upper class citizen, it challenges the narrative that these were marginal beliefs and attitudes. I mean, so we have to really question history and look at it with great scrutiny. And right now, I think part of what we need to do is, now that we are safe to, without being targeted, reconstruct as much as possible these approaches to spirituality. And part of the reconstruction is a deconstruction of the the mindset that we've been inculcated in the Western world for hundreds and hundreds of years, if not really a couple thousand years almost. We have to learn to view magic differently. We have to learn to view religion differently, and revisit these terms on the terms of the people who used them in ways that were not Christian or Abrahamic. Religion isn't a bad word. And to assume that people before Christianity or during Christianity who did not practice it were not religious and did not have approaches to interacting with the divine, or did not interact or did not believe in a form of the divine that was sublime and refined, is a conceit that has been taught to us. We have to unlearn these conceits. As I mentioned during the episode, the inheritance of evangelical Protestantism, evangelical Christianity, the Protestant tradition, cannot be underestimated. Anybody who has visited a quote-unquote neo-pagan gathering in America, at least, and I hear in England, if you go to Glastonbury, there's a similar sort of phenomenon. You can't help but see the inheritance of that among people who, though they've rejected Christianity on a surface level, they have not uprooted the Protestant ethos from their minds. And you see it in neo-paganism, you see it in heathenism, you see it all over the place. And really, if we're going to embrace these approaches to the spiritual life, we have to meet the paradigm on its own terms. And sometimes that requires us to go through a process of unlearning where we go back to zero.
Right. Okay. So I think it's time to move on. So what do you have for us this week for your book review, Janice?
So Janus's book review for this week is a follow-up on the book review from the prior episode. Those who have listened to the episode preceding this one know that I spoke about the Book of Gold, which is an excellent Psalm workbook. Really practical and useful. It's a translation, has connection to the Sefer Shemush, to Tehillim, all of that. Well, this is another Psalm. I figured I'd follow up with another practical Psalm book. This one is published by Troy Books, and it is called The Charmer's Psalter. It's a useful little book, and it gives you translations of the Psalms, the magical Psalms, and it also has a section at the end with some verbal charms. But the magical Psalms, the uses for them are exorcism, blessing of the working ground, to avert evil, to defend against enemies and return curses, for safety, to expose slanderers, liars, and persecutors, against evil spirits and people, against magic, to dispel melancholy, against poverty, and for success in business, to cause love, to return evil upon enemies, and even to raise dark assistance against enemies. There's a lot more too. So it gives you the purpose, and then it gives you the psalm, and sometimes it'll give you a couple of different psalms you can use, or verses from certain psalms that you can use for this purpose. So it's really useful. I'll pick one out randomly here. Let's see. Against evil spirits and people, Psalms 101 and 68. These two psalms are to be together written upon parchment or paper and carried upon the person as a charm. And then sometimes it'll give you one of the holy names that you're supposed to use. For instance, in the one against persecution, you use Psalm 11 or 12, and you use the holy name Pele, which means wonderful, either held in thought, or I believe if you were to make a document like a letter, you would write that on the letter. But the point is, it's a very useful little workbook. It comes in hardcover and softcover. It's good for people who like to use the Psalms, who feel the Psalms are effective. It's useful. It comes in a small format, so you can throw it in your pocket. About 120 pages. And at the back, they have a Welsh cursing charm, a Suffolk charm against thieves, a mourning charm for protection against thieves and enemies, witches' herb gathering charms for illness in general, bone setting charms, all kinds of things for toothache. So it's really useful, and I recommend it. Again, you could get this in the Book of Gold and have a lot to work with in experimenting and practically using the Psalms in effective magical work.
Great. What's the title again?
It is called The Charmer's Psalter. Gemma Gary is the one who composed it. It is published by Troy Books, which is usually that publishing house is a smorgasbord of utility. So I want to give them a shout out, and I want to just mention that this is a great little book. And yeah.
A smorgasbord of utility. Nice. Okay. Where were we? I think that's it for today. We appreciate everyone listening from all around the world. Please give us a rating and review where you can.
Feel free to shoot us a message on any of the platforms, on Facebook, whatever, comment on YouTube. We love hearing from you. We're always interested. We're also open to your ideas. If you ever have a guest you'd like to hear that you think would be compatible with the theme of the show, just let us know and we'll do our best to reach out to them if it would fit with what we do.
Okay. On that note, we will see you in the next episode.